Everyone knows that Sega and Nintendo were big competitors, especially in the early 90s. The Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo were going head to head. However, some people might be under the misconception that both consoles came out around the same time. This is not true. There was a 2-year gap where the Genesis was actually competing against Nintendo's previous console, the NES. With the Genesis having far superior hardware, was Sega the clear victor, or is there more to the story? Let's take a look. What's going on? It's Podrez, coming at you with another video. Alright, before we start, if you've seen a couple of my videos and you like what I do, hit that subscribe button right there. We're almost at 13,000, let's get there. And we do have a Discord server, just go to discord.podrez.net. I'll also put a link right in the description. Alright, let's get started with the Sega Genesis before Sonic. Sega was having trouble getting the right footing in the gaming industry. Their first console in Japan, the SG-1000, had some decent games, but the technology was outdated for its time, with the Famicom outclassing it in every way. While it did see some initial success, the Famicom had better third-party support and better hardware. It was the clear winner. Sega would try to address this hardware issue by releasing the updated Master System, which did have superior hardware over the Famicom, or the NES in the States. However, hardware is not everything. The Master System was the perfect example of this. Sega still did not have the third-party support that it really needed, and as a result, it did not have a great lineup of games. Unfortunately, Sega would lose to Nintendo once again. In order to beat Nintendo, Sega needed to make a console that was better than the NES in every way, and to find a way around the lack of third-party support. Nintendo had an exclusivity agreement with game companies that prevented them from being able to publish games on other consoles. This meant that Nintendo's competitors wouldn't see games from well-known companies like Konami or Capcom. However, Sega had a plan. For one, Sega wanted to address the hardware. While the Master System had superior hardware, they wanted their next console to stand out against the NES in ways that were unimaginable. This meant having more colors on screen, big sprites, better sound capabilities, and parallax scrolling. Introducing these elements would really make the console stick out from its competition. In October of 1988, Sega released their new console called the Mega Drive in Japan, and in late August 1989, it was released in the US called the Genesis. But how would the Genesis beat Nintendo when their other consoles did not? Keep in mind, there was a 2-year period before Sonic the Hedgehog came out, which would greatly drive sales of the Genesis. Before Sonic, Sega would have a lot of trouble selling the new console. Looking at the hardware, the Genesis did achieve their goal of beating the NES decisively. The console was capable of handling big colorful sprites and many of them on screen at once. This would allow for arcade-like graphics. In contrast, the NES had to use much smaller sprites with less detail, and there couldn't be too many on screen at once. Genesis games could also be bigger. NES games could only hold up to 32 kilobytes of ROM space without using enhancement chips. The Genesis, however, could support up to 4 megabytes, which is a massive improvement. The Genesis would also receive a massive upgrade in RAM, with 64 kilobytes of RAM total, plus an additional 64 kilobytes of video RAM. The NES only supported 2 kilobytes of video RAM and 2 kilobytes of work RAM. Big difference. But one of the biggest advantages of the Genesis over the NES was parallax scrolling. For those who don't know, that's when you have a background layer that moves slower than the foreground, which gives the illusion of depth. The foreground will usually have the level itself that you interact with, and the background is usually for mountains or something far away. The Genesis has 2 layers of scrolling so that you can easily reserve the second layer for background graphics. But the NES only had 1 scrolling layer, so if you want background mountains, they need to be placed in the foreground layer, so it's all going to scroll at the same speed. It won't look quite as good. So clearly the Genesis is way better in terms of hardware than the NES, but what really matters is the lineup of games. The CEO, Katz, came up with a plan to compete against Nintendo. His focus was arcade ports. He thought that bringing the arcade experience home was how he was going to sell the Genesis, and it's actually not too far off considering how large the sprites can be and how many colors a Genesis can support. He would also be more aggressive in commercials and attacking Nintendo whenever possible. Katz also had a solution against Nintendo's superior third-party support. The first one was partnering with Capcom. Although they were a licensee of Nintendo, Capcom allowed Sega to release their arcade titles on the Genesis. This was a creative way of sort of bypassing their lack of third-party support. One of the games Sega ported over was Ghouls and Ghosts. The NES had the predecessor Ghosts and Goblins, but did not have the sequel, so this was a way to make the NES look obsolete. You play as Arthur and you must make it to the end of the game without dying. You can collect weapon upgrades along the way, although the sword is the best one by far. The game is notoriously difficult where you can only take 2 hits before you die. This game happens to showcase a console's capabilities with very large sprites and lots of colors on screen. This happens to be one of the best arcade ports of Ghouls and Ghosts, and definitely a great start to making the Genesis look good. Not only did Sega do a good job porting over Capcom's titles, but they also brought over some of their own arcade games. The game Golden Axe is a decent beat-em-up and a very faithful arcade port. Columns is a fun Tetris clone where you have to line up 3 colors in a row. Once again, this is a very well done arcade port. Sega's strategy of selling their games was by securing licenses to well-known properties like cartoons, famous singers, and athletes. They managed to obtain the license to Mickey Mouse, so they released Castle of Illusion. This is a basic platformer where you must make it to the end without losing. Your main attack is bouncing off enemies, similar to Mario, except you have to press the C button in order to actually perform the bounce. If you just try to jump on them, you'll take damage. Very interesting that it's not automatic. The game also showcased the power of the Genesis with very diverse and colorful graphics. When standing still, Mickey Mouse will change animation, which is actually a new feature in console games. These are the types of innovations Sega needed to stand out. Another attempt at one-upping Sega was the release of Buster Douglas's Knockout Boxing. Years earlier, Nintendo released Mike Tyson's Punch-Out!, so when Buster defeated Tyson in 1990, Sega immediately capitalized on this by publishing a boxing game featuring the new champion. Graphically, the game shows off the Genesis very well. The sprites are very large and the game is colorful. But what about the gameplay? Going back to Punch-Out!, this wasn't much of a boxing simulator, but it wasn't a button masher either. You had to learn your opponent and use strategies to beat them. The fact that your opponents are so cartoony and memorable really helped make this game stand out. Buster Douglas, however, is just a very boring button masher that isn't memorable at all. Also, unrelated, but Buster Douglas would lose his very first title defense against Evander Holyfield. Speaking of games featuring athletes, the Genesis did have some very early sports games. Pat Riley's Basketball is a very standard basketball game, but has some very large sprites to make itself stand out from the NES. Joe Montana Football is another basic football game. It's okay, but it's got nothing on Tecmo Bowl. Sega would give official sequels to some of their franchises. Shinobi, which was previously an arcade title which then became a Master System game, received an official sequel called Revenge of Shinobi. It's a platformer where you can throw ninja stars and you must make it to the end without dying. The original games had a gimmick where you had to migrate between 2 layers by performing a super jump. Revenge of Shinobi, however, is more of a standard platformer, and I prefer that because it allows for much better level design, although there are some stages where you can migrate between the foreground and the background. This game would really show off the Genesis's capabilities with colorful graphics, parallax scrolling, and fantastic music. The game has so much variety too, every stage looks completely different from one another. The controls are not super great though. You can perform a mid-air jump, but your timing has to be perfect, otherwise it doesn't happen. On a few occasions, I missed the timing and ended up dying. I also wish you could switch between ninja stars and your sword, but instead you throw ninja stars by default unless you're near a box or an enemy. In this game, you definitely have to conserve your ninja stars, so it's very unfortunate that you can't switch between the two. This game is notable for having a ton of revisions. The original release contained characters that strongly resembled Batman and Godzilla, both of which were unauthorized. To avoid legal issues, future revisions of the game would change the sprites. Revenge of Shinobi is a fantastic game and one of the stronger earlier Genesis titles. So it seems like Michael Katz and Sega as a whole had the right strategy with combating Nintendo's offerings. They made their games enticing by securing licenses to well-known figures, and they included a variety of different types of games. We saw arcade ports, sports games, platformers, beat-em-ups, and Tetris clones. However, there were some issues. For one, Sega's decision to make Altered Beast their pack-in game was questionable. Here, you play as a resurrected man who must save Zeus's daughter Athena. It's an auto-scrolling platformer where you collect spirit balls to transform into a beast. It's a well-done arcade port, and it does show off some of the capabilities of the Genesis. There's parallax scrolling, large sprites, lots of colors on screen, and digitized voices.
Welcome to your doom.
While not a terrible game, the controls are very clunky and the game is too short, only 5 levels. You can easily run through this entire game in less than 10 minutes, and there's really not much to it. Pack-in titles are usually going to be the buyer's introduction to the console, so it should leave a lasting impression, and I'm not sure if Altered Beast does that. Compare this to Super Mario Bros. Or what Sega would eventually make their pack-in title, Sonic the Hedgehog. The other issue is the lineup of games. Sega's lack of third-party support meant that they would not receive a lot of high-profile games at the NES Scot. The hardware might be better, but that means nothing if there's a weak lineup of games. I don't think Sega's arcade titles are enough to entice people. And the celebrity games are cool, but Sega's gonna have to do more than that if they want to beat Nintendo. I think Michael Katz did everything he could to make the Genesis more attractive, but unfortunately he didn't meet the company's goals, and Nakayama, who was the president of Sega of Japan, would replace him. The new CEO, Tom Kalinske, would drop the price of the Genesis, make more aggressive commercials, and replace the pack-in game with Sonic the Hedgehog. With these changes, the console would see much greater success. Let me know in the comments, what would you have done to make the Genesis more successful? And do you think Michael Katz could have made it happen if he were given more time? After their previous consoles failed, Sega created one that was even more powerful with arcade-like graphics. Under Michael Katz, the company would try spinning their console as an at-home arcade, as well as securing licenses to celebrities, hoping to entice potential buyers. The early years of the Genesis would see some decent games, but none of their efforts would be enough to beat Nintendo. Hey, I just wanted to thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this far, hit that like button. If you enjoy this type of content, hit the subscribe button for more content. Both of these things really help the channel grow. If you have anything to share, feel free to leave a comment. I read every single comment on this channel, and I'm pretty good at replying back. Anyway, have a good one.